A disaster isn't coming. It's already begun. Right now, as you watch this, the ground beneath Sicily, Sicily continues to crack open. Every hour, the chasm grows wider. Every hour, more homes teeter on the edge of a 50-meter drop. 1 minute ago, civil protection teams recorded another 10-meter collapse along the fracture line. The Earth isn't finished here, and 1,500 people don't know if they'll ever go home again. This isn't just another landslide. This is the moment when an entire town discovered that the ground they trusted for generations was never truly solid at all. It began with Cyclone Harry's relentless assault on southern Italy 3 days ago. The storm arrived like a freight train, carrying moisture from the Mediterranean that would soon turn solid Earth into liquid terror. On January 25th, at exactly 12 p.m. UTC, rainfall rates spiked beyond anything the region's clay soils could absorb. Weather stations across central Sicily recorded precipitation levels that shattered century-old records. In Sicily, a town of 25,000 souls nestled on a plateau in Caltanissetta province, the first cracks appeared along Via Roma just after noon. Within 6 hours, what started as minor fissures had become something unthinkable. A translational slide tore through Sicily's plateau, creating a 4-kilometer gash that geologists are calling catastrophic. The failure scarp now runs like an open wound across the landscape, deeper than a 15-story building in some sections. Drone footage reveals the true scope of destruction. Vehicles hang over vertical edges, their rear wheels spinning uselessly in mid-air. Buildings split in half reveal interior walls like dollhouses, their foundations exposed like broken teeth against the raw earth. One video captures a 2-story house slowly tilting backward into the void, its red tile roof catching the afternoon sun as gravity claims another victim. Emergency responders arriving on scene described a landscape that defied comprehension. Captain Marco Benedetti of the local Civil Protection Unit told reporters, "In 30 years of disaster response, I have never seen the Earth simply disappear like this. One moment there was a neighborhood, the next, there was nothing but air." The coordinates 37.15 degrees north, 14.39 degrees east, now mark not a peaceful Sicilian town, but ground zero for one of Italy's most dramatic geological events in recent memory. Satellite imagery from Meteo AM shows the plateau's edge retreating inland at measurable rates, with each hourly update revealing fresh collapse zones. This wasn't random chaos, this was physics in its most brutal form. Sicily sits on saturated clay layers that turn liquid under pressure. When Cyclone Harry dumped unprecedented rainfall across the plateau, those layers simply gave way. The clay sandy soils that had supported the town for centuries lost all structural integrity in a matter of hours. But that's only part of the story. The landslide isn't slowing down. If anything, it's accelerating. What's happening beneath Sicily follows a terrifying geological pattern that scientists have studied but rarely witnessed at this scale. The mechanism is deceptively simple, which makes it all the more frightening. Clay-rich soils, when saturated beyond their absorption capacity, undergo a phase change that transforms solid ground into something resembling liquid concrete. Geologists call this a translational slide, entire sections of Earth sliding along a planar surface toward the valley below, following the path of least resistance. Satellite imagery from Meteo AM's monitoring stations shows water infiltration destabilizing soil layers that have remained stable for decades. The rain from Cyclone Harry didn't just wet the surface, it penetrated deep into the clay matrix, filling every microscopic void until the soil structure could no longer support its own weight. Dr. Elena Rossini, a geomorphologist from the University of Catania, who has studied Mediterranean slope failures for 2 decades, explains the process. When clay becomes oversaturated, it loses all cohesion. The individual particles can no longer bind together. What was once solid earth becomes a flowing mass that obeys gravity like water, but carries the destructive power of thousands of tons of rock and soil. The data from ground-penetrating radar reveals the slide's internal structure. The failure plane sits approximately 6 meters below the original surface, following a layer of particularly weak sedimentary rock that formed millions of years ago when this region lay beneath an ancient sea. That prehistoric seabed has become modern Sicily's Achilles heel. Geologists from Free Astroscience confirm the mechanism. Rainwater acts like a lubricant, allowing massive sections of Earth to move as coherent blocks. Their field measurements show that some sections of the slide are moving at rates of several centimeters per hour, imperceptible to the naked eye but devastating when sustained over days. This type of failure creates a domino effect that engineers call progressive retreat. As each section collapses, it removes lateral support from the area behind it, causing the failure zone to migrate steadily inland. Historical data from similar events in Mediterranean regions shows this process can continue for months, sometimes years, until the slope finds a new angle of stability. The physics are relentless. Each cubic meter of saturated clay weighs approximately 2 tons. Multiply that across the 4-kilometer failure zone, and the forces involved become astronomical. The Earth isn't just sliding, it's flowing like a glacier made of mud and stone, carrying everything in its path toward the valley floor 40 meters below. Temperature measurements from thermal imaging drones reveal another troubling detail. The friction generated by the massive slide is actually heating the soil, creating localized warm zones that show up as bright patches on infrared cameras. This heat generation suggests the movement involves enormous internal stresses and that the slide contains far more potential energy than initial estimates suggested. Yet what comes next could be even worse. Because the rain isn't finished with Sicily, and the compromised soil structure means even light precipitation could trigger catastrophic additional failures. Nisemi has faced this terror before, and the memories still haunt residents who remember when the earth last betrayed their trust. Local records trace landslides in this region back to the 1790s, when parish priests first began documenting great movings of the earth in church ledgers. These weren't minor slope failures, they were landscape-altering events that redrew property lines and sometimes swallowed entire farms. Francesco Zarba, a 73-year-old retired mason who has lived in Nisemi his entire life, recalls with painful clarity the major collapse that struck 30 years ago. It was autumn, 1996, he says, his weathered hands tracing the outline of the old failure zone on a faded municipal map. The rains came hard that year, just like now. We lost the Antonelli farm. The whole thing just archive footage from that earlier disaster shows eerily similar scarring along the plateau's edge. The failure was smaller then, perhaps half a kilometer long, but it followed the exact same geological weakness that has now given way catastrophically. Local officials promised stabilization measures, retaining walls were planned, drainage systems were proposed. None of it happened. They said it was stable, Zarba told reporters yesterday, standing at a safe distance from the current failure zone. They brought in engineers, took soil samples, made big promises, but nothing changed. We knew this day would come. We just didn't know it would be so enormous. The pattern repeats with heartbreaking consistency across Italy's geological history. In 1988, the town of Cavallerizzo in Calabria experienced similar progressive retreat that ultimately forced the permanent evacuation of 800 residents. In 2003, Monteforte Irpino in Campania lost an entire neighborhood to a translational slide triggered by just 48 hours of heavy rain. Each time, the mechanism remained the same. Saturated clay soils reaching their failure threshold, catastrophic collapse, promises of intervention, and then nothing. The fundamental vulnerability persists because addressing it would require engineering projects costing hundreds of millions of euros, money that small municipalities simply don't have. But Nisemi's geological scars tell an even deeper story. Aerial photography from the 1950s shows stress fractures along the current failure line that were already visible 70 years ago. The warning signs were there, literally written in the landscape, for anyone who knew how to read them. Local geologist Dr. Giuseppe Termini, who conducted soil surveys in the area during the 1980s, admits to a haunting sense of déjà vu. We identified this exact zone as high risk for translational failure in our 1984 report, he revealed in an interview yesterday. The clay content was too high, the slope angle too steep, the drainage insufficient, but implementing our recommendations would have required relocating part of the town. No one wanted to hear that. The human cost of that decades-old inaction is now being measured in displacement, trauma, and shattered communities. Teresa Lombardi, a 45-year-old teacher whose family home now hangs precariously over the chasm's edge, captures the bitter irony.
My grandmother lived through the war, survived the earthquakes, raised 6 children in that house, and now it's going to fall into a hole because we wouldn't listen to the ground when it tried to warn us.
And now, scientists fear history may be repeating itself on a scale that will make all previous failures seem minor by comparison. As of this morning, the danger zone has expanded beyond all initial projections, transforming what officials hoped would be a contained emergency into an evolving crisis that threatens the very existence of Nisemi as a functioning community. Civil protection teams conducting round-the-clock monitoring have been forced to increase the evacuation radius 3 times since Sunday. What began as a 50-meter safety perimeter has grown to 150 meters from the chasm's edge, encompassing not just homes near the immediate failure zone, but entire neighborhoods that seemed safely distant just 48 hours ago. More than 1,500 people have been displaced, a figure that initially stood at 1,000 but continues climbing as the red zone expands. The evacuation has taken on the characteristics of a military operation, with residents given just minutes to gather essential belongings before abandoning homes that may never be habitable again. The town's main sports arena has been converted into an emergency shelter, its basketball court now lined with cots and portable privacy screens. Local resident Maria Costanza, evacuated with her 3 children and elderly mother, describes the scene.
You hear crying, you hear people on phones trying to reach insurance companies, you hear children asking when they can go home. But mostly, you hear silence, because what do you say when the ground disappears?
Infrastructure damage extends far beyond residential areas. The vital road connecting Nisemi to the coastal city of Gela has been severed, forcing a detour that adds 45 minutes to what was once a 20-minute drive. The SS-117 highway, a critical regional artery, remains closed indefinitely after sections of the roadbed simply vanished into the expanding chasm. Schools across the affected area have shuttered, leaving nearly 3,000 students in educational limbo. The municipal building itself sits within the expanded danger zone, forcing the temporary relocation of essential services to a warehouse facility on the town's outskirts. Power and water systems throughout central Nisemi operate under emergency protocols. Utility workers describe the challenge of maintaining services when the infrastructure they depend on keeps disappearing. "We repair a water main in the morning, and by evening it's hanging in midair," explains Antonio Greco, a municipal engineer. "How do you plan for that?" The economic implications compound hourly. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's government declared a state of emergency yesterday, allocating €100 million from the National Disaster Fund for immediate response efforts. But provisional estimates place storm-related damages across Sicily, Sardinia, and Calabria at over €1 billion, and Nisemi's ongoing crisis represents just a fraction of that total. Insurance assessors attempting to evaluate residential losses face an unprecedented challenge. How do you calculate the value of a house that half exists? Property records for the affected area may require complete revision, as familiar address numbers now mark empty air rather than solid ground. The numbers tell a story of accelerating crisis that defies traditional disaster response protocols. What started as a localized slope failure now threatens to sever Nisemi's remaining connections to the outside world. Emergency planners work with scenarios that sound like science fiction: complete isolation of the town center, permanent loss of historical districts, potential abandonment of entire neighborhoods. Mayor Massimiliano Conti, speaking at yesterday's emergency briefing, chose his words carefully but couldn't hide the gravity of the situation. "We are facing something unprecedented," he admitted. "Our emergency plans assumed we would be dealing with damaged buildings, not missing buildings. We assumed the ground would remain ground." The mayor's use of the word dire, a term Italian officials rarely employ in public statements, signals the depth of official concern. Behind closed doors, municipal leaders discuss contingencies that include partial evacuation of the entire town if the slide continues its inland progression. Because what happens next could rewrite the map of central Sicily, erasing a community that has stood for over 8 centuries and creating a cautionary tale about the price of ignoring geological warning signs. Weather forecasts for tomorrow could determine whether Nisemi survives as an intact community or becomes the first major Italian town to be partially abandoned due to progressive geological failure. Meteo-Am's meteorological monitoring stations predict dry conditions today, a temporary reprieve that allows emergency teams to work without the immediate threat of additional rainfall, destabilizing the already compromised terrain. But that window is heartbreakingly brief. Light rainfall returns on January 28th, with precipitation totals that would normally be considered insignificant. Under normal circumstances, a few millimeters of rain wouldn't merit mention in weather reports. But these are no longer normal circumstances. Even minimal precipitation could trigger additional collapses in terrain where the soil structure has been fundamentally compromised. The clay layers beneath Nisemi remain saturated from Cyclone Harry's assault, and their absorption capacity has been exceeded for days. Dr. Alessandro Martelli, the chief seismologist coordinating the government's monitoring effort, explains the precarious balance. "We are essentially waiting to see if the slope can find stability naturally, or if external factors will push it past additional failure thresholds. Every raindrop becomes a variable in an equation where the stakes are measured in human lives and homes." Overnight monitoring reveals that the landslide remains frighteningly active. Between midnight and dawn this morning, survey teams documented the appearance of fresh 25-meter vertical cuts along the failure zone's northern edge. These new collapses occurred without any external trigger, just the inexorable force of gravity working on unstabilized soil. The round-the-clock observation post reports sounds that veteran geologists describe as unlike anything in their experience. Residents evacuated from nearby areas speak of hearing the earth creak during quiet moments, subtle groans and settling noises that suggest enormous masses of soil continuing to shift and adjust. Acoustic monitoring equipment picks up low-frequency vibrations consistent with ongoing internal movement within the slide mass. Dust plumes mark each new collapse, visible from several kilometers away as brown clouds that rise suddenly from the chasm and drift eastward on the Mediterranean breeze. These dust signatures have become an unofficial early warning system, alerting monitoring teams to fresh failures even when visibility is limited. Expert teams from Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology admit they cannot predict where the next major failure will occur. Ground-penetrating radar shows stress fractures extending several hundred meters inland from the current failure zone. But translating those subsurface features into reliable collapse predictions remains beyond current scientific capability. "We can measure what has happened and observe what is happening," explains Dr. Francesca Bianchi, a geotechnical engineer leading the soil stability assessment. "But predicting exactly when and where the next section will fail requires understanding forces and variables that we simply cannot measure in real time. The Earth keeps its secrets until the moment it reveals them catastrophically." The uncertainty extends beyond immediate collapse risks to longer-term geological evolution. Computer models suggest that the slope will eventually reach a new stable angle, but those calculations span years or decades, not days. In the meantime, the progressive retreat could continue consuming the town from its edges inward, like a slow-motion disaster that unfolds over months. Longer-term weather forecasts for late January show mild temperatures around 10 to 14 degrees Celsius, with scattered showers, conditions that could prolong soil saturation and extend the period of elevated risk. The Mediterranean climate that normally makes this region so livable has become an enemy, with every cloud viewed as a potential trigger for renewed catastrophe. The ground beneath Nisemi is no longer solid earth. It has become a fractured shell of its former self, a landscape balanced on the edge of further transformation. Residents describe an apocalyptic soundtrack of settling ground and shifting soil that continues day and night. Some report being unable to sleep, not from fear alone, but from the subtle but persistent sounds of a community slowly coming apart. Emergency response coordinators work with scenarios that read like disaster fiction, but represent increasingly probable realities. Complete severance of the town center from surrounding areas. Loss of the historic district that dates to medieval times. Permanent displacement of thousands of residents, whose roots in this soil stretch back generations. And every hour brings the possibility that the chasm will cut deeper into Nisemi's heart, severing the last roads that connect this ancient community to the modern world and creating an island of isolation where a thriving town once stood. The earth has spoken with a voice of splitting stone and sliding soil, delivering a verdict that decades of human denial could not prevent. No one knows when it will finish pronouncing its judgment or how much of Nisemi will remain when the ground finally finds its peace. Stay safe, stay informed, and keep watching as the earth rewrites the rules.